My name is Silas. My son thought his strength made him king of the house I built with my own hands. One evening in front of his wife, he raised his hand against me, not once, not twice, but 20 times. The first blow was a shock, a lightning bolt of betrayal that stole the air from my lungs. The second was a confirmation of a truth I had been swallowing for years. By the fifth, a strange, cold clarity descended upon me. Each slap was met with her smirk, her quiet, giddy laugh, as though I were nothing but a punchline in their private joke. I stayed silent. I counted every strike, my voice a tomb in my chest. My cheeks burned, but my resolve froze into something harder than iron. He thought he had humiliated me, reduced me to a frail old man. He didn't know I still held the deed to his entire world. I remember the beginning, a time when my hands were his sanctuary. He was just a boy with scraped knees and a heart full of wonder, chasing a ball down a street I'd paved with overtime and exhaustion. He looked up to me with eyes that believed I could build anything, fix anything, conquer anything. And maybe I could. I taught him how to swing a hammer so it wouldn't bruise his thumb, how to measure a line straight, how to cut wood so it fit flush and true. We worked side by side when he was young, his small, clumsy hands trying to copy the scarred and calloused map of mine. I remember the fierce pride on his face when he finally drove a nail in without bending it, a tiny triumph I cherished more than any paycheck. Those were the moments I thought were forging him, tempering him into a man who understood effort, who revered sacrifice, who knew the sacred language of building something that lasts. When he grew older and the bank demanded a guarantor for his house, a name with history, a signature with trust, I gave mine without a second thought. I had spent a lifetime building my name into something solid, something banks respected. I signed the mortgage papers with a hand that was steady, my mind filled with visions of his future, never imagining those same hands would one day be used to beat the life out of my own face. At the time, all I felt was a father's fierce, blinding pride. Pride that he would have a strong roof over his head, pride that my son could live in comfort while I quietly carried the weight of the debt on my stooped shoulders. I gave him the house not just as a shelter, but as a covenant, a place to raise children, a place to build a life filled with dinners and laughter, a testament to the world that our family line was strong and enduring. That house was not just wood and brick. It was my blood and sweat pressed into the drywall. It was the ghost of every cold dawn I'd spent on a roofing crew, the sun burning the back of my neck. It was the echo of every missed meal, every pair of boots resoled until the leather cracked, every silent prayer for just one more week of work. It was my ultimate gift, the kind a father gives without ever expecting a receipt. For years, I would walk by it in the evenings with a quiet, profound satisfaction. When I saw the golden light in the windows, I thought, my son is safe. When I saw him mowing the lawn, I thought, my son is steady. When I saw his wife smiling in the doorway, I thought, my son has built his happiness. And I believed, with the foolish, stubborn hope of a parent, that gratitude lived like a warm ember in his chest, even if he never fanned it with words. But the truth, heavy and ugly, shouldered its way in. The house that was supposed to be a sacred gift became my private grief. He forgot its origin. He forgot whose signature, whose life's work, had swung the door open. He began to speak with a possessiveness that cut me, as if my hands had never smoothed the foundation, as if my sweat had never sealed the shingles. The quiet gratitude I'd imagined curdled into arrogance, and that arrogance, fed by his wife's approving smiles, hardened into a casual, dismissive cruelty. Still I stayed silent. A father hopes. A father makes excuses. A father clings to the memory of the boy, even when faced with the man. I told myself he was young, that pride was a phase, that respect would return with time. I told myself my patience was a virtue, but my patience became the very rope I used to hang myself. I gave him everything, and one night, bloated with drink and his own misplaced power, he repaid my lifetime of gifts with 20 stinging slaps. As my face burned, I remembered the small, earnest boy with the hammer. I remembered the house, the papers, the skipped meals, the exhausted hours. The long road that began with sacrifice ended that night in a symphony of humiliation. The gift had festered into grief, and the grief, in that moment, turned into a rage colder than any winter I'd ever endured. It did not start with fists. It never does. It began with words, sharp and serrated, tossed across the dinner table like daggers. Old man, dead weight. His wife Lena was his chorus, her laughter a tinkling bell that rang with every cruel jab. She filled his glass, her body leaning into his, and with each sip he grew bolder, his insults shifting from my age to my usefulness, from my presence to my very right to exist in his home. I sat silent, the food on my plate congealing, my hands resting on the table to hide their tremor. I told myself to be a stone, to be unmovable, but then came the shove. His hand, strong from a life I had financed, slammed into my shoulder, knocking me back in my chair. It wasn't hard enough to topple me, but it was hard enough to draw a burst of laughter from the both of them. And when laughter blesses cruelty, cruelty finds its courage. He slapped me once. The crack of his palm against my cheek was a sound I felt in my teeth. Before the shock could even register, he did it again. The second one hurt more, not from the force, but from the sheer theatrical shame of it. Lena covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with giggles she didn't even try to hide, her eyes gleaming with delight. He looked around, a performer basking in his own brutality. The count grew in my mind, a grim liturgy. 3, 4, 5. Each slap was punctuated with a curse, a fresh insult. 6, 7, 8. My face was on fire, my vision blurring not from the impact, but from the pressure of the humiliation, a physical weight trying to crush me into the floor. 9, 10, 11. I could feel the heat of their collective gaze, their enjoyment a palpable thing in the room. 12, 13, 14. His hand was beginning to tire, but his pride was a bottomless well. 15, 16, 17. My ears rang, the skin around my eyes swelling, but I did not move. I did not blink. 18, 19, 20. When the last one fell, the room was silent for a single, suspended breath. Then Lena brought her hands together in a slow, mocking clap. "Bravo," she whispered, the word dripping with venom. My chest rose and fell. Slow and heavy, I could taste the coppery tang of blood where my lip had split against my teeth, but I swallowed it down. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me spit. My hands remained folded in my lap. My back remained straight. I would not raise my voice. I would not strike back. I sat, a statue of stillness, while they reveled in what they thought was my defeat. They mistook my silence for weakness. They mistook my stillness for surrender. But what they could not see was the final, fragile thread of a father's love snapping in my chest, replaced by a glacial calm. That hour was the longest of my life. Every slap was not just skin on skin. It was a memory erased. It was a lesson unlearned. It was 30 years of sacrifice spat upon and ground into the floorboards. He did not just hit me 20 times. He hit every nail I had ever driven, every dollar I had ever saved, every silent hope I had ever carried. And when it was over, I rose from the table, my movements deliberate and calm, nodded once, a final, formal dismissal, and walked out of the room. No shouting, no begging, just a silence that was about to become my most powerful weapon. Before I reveal what happened next, I want you to pause for a moment. Where are you watching this from right now? Let me know in the comments. And if you're understanding my pain, please subscribe so this story can reach others. The slaps ended that night, but the shame was a stain that would not wash off. Bruises fade, swelling recedes, but humiliation metastasizes. It follows you into every room, down every street. The next morning, when I stepped outside, the world had changed. Neighbors on their porches would look at me, then quickly look away. Their glances were no longer polite nods, but diagnoses. They had heard, they knew. His wife had made sure of it. That night she had pulled out her phone, her smile wide and vicious as she recorded my degradation. A video snippet, a picture of my reddened face, all posted online with a caption that read, "Respect your elders, not in this house." Her friends laughed in the comments, a digital echo of the laughter that had filled the room. By morning, my shame was public property. The private violation had been broadcast, and the street carried the news faster than any fist could travel. The house I built, the one I signed for, the one I gave him, had become the stage for my destruction. Every brick that stood strong now felt like a judgment. Every wall that once sheltered me now felt like a prison. I could feel the weight of the roof, the very roof I had nailed into place, pressing down on me, heavier than any load I had ever carried. The social death was a slow, cold poison. Neighbors stopped waving. Old friends found reasons to be busy. Even distant family members spoke to me in the hushed, careful tones reserved for the terminally ill. Their eyes held not warmth, but a pity that was its own form of contempt. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the public knowing. the fact that my value had been publicly assessed and found to be zero. I heard children whisper as I passed. I saw adults lower their voices, their conversations dying as I drew near. The sting of his hand was gone from my cheek, but the sting of their whispers was a fresh brand every day. I was no longer Silas, the builder, the father, the man. I was the old man who got slapped 20 times by his own son. That was my new name. That was my epitaph. Inside that house, the silence was a different kind of torture. He walked through the halls as if nothing had happened. Lena would brush past me in the hallway, her perfume a trail of her disdain. They laughed together in the kitchen, the sound carrying a joyful noise that was sharper than any slap. They were living in a world of their own making, a world where my pain was entertainment, my dignity a forgotten relic. That house, my ultimate gift, had become a monument to my own foolishness, proof that I had given too much, trusted too blindly, loved too unconditionally. And as the days bled into one another, the shame did not shrink. It grew, fed by every whisper, every averted glance, every shared laugh from the kitchen. But shame has two faces. One is pain, the other is clarity. And as I carried the first, the second began to burn through the fog of my despair. They had turned my gift into their stage. They had turned my silence into their comedy. They had burned my dignity to ashes for their warmth. But they had forgotten one thing: the papers, the deed, the title. The house he thought was his kingdom, the very walls that had witnessed my humiliation, were still mine on paper. He had mocked me inside a cage that I still held the key to. And as the world laughed, I began to plan my quiet, final exit. That night when the house was finally still and the echoes of their laughter had faded, I did not sleep. I sat at the old wooden table in my room, a single lamp casting a small island of light in the darkness. The rest of the house was a void, a cavern of ingratitude. From under my bed I pulled out a metal lockbox, its surface cool to the touch. Inside were not just papers, but the archived bones of my entire life, and among them the most important document of all, the deed to this house. I laid it on the table, smoothing its creases with a hand that was now steady. I stared at my name, printed in stark, official ink. Silas Grayson, sole owner. His name was nowhere, not on the deed, not on the mortgage I was still paying. He was a squatter in a castle he thought he'd inherited, a king by his own proclamation, but the law knew the truth. The same hands he had struck were the hands that still legally owned every brick, every nail, every splinter of wood in this place. I thought back to the day I signed those papers. I had stood tall in the banker's office, my back straight, my signature a promise of stability for my son's future. I believed I was building his legacy. Now I saw it for what it was. I had built my own prison and handed him the keys. But prisons, I realized that night, could be demolished. The plan formed not in a hot rush of anger, but in the cold, clear stillness of absolute resolve. I would not scream. I would not fight him with my fists. I would use a weapon he had forgotten existed, the unassailable, impersonal power of the law. I would not merely leave. I would unmake the world he lived in. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I dressed in my oldest, most worn clothes, the uniform of the laborer I had always been. I tucked the deed into an inner pocket, right over my heart. Each step I took away from that house felt like pulling a thorn from my flesh. I did not look back. My lawyer, a man named Arthur who had handled my affairs for decades, looked up from his desk as I entered. He took one look at my face, the fading yellow bruises a map of my shame, and his professional calm tightened into something harder. "Silas," he said, his voice low. "What happened?" I didn't tell him the whole story. The humiliation was still too raw. I simply placed the deed on his polished desk. "I want to sell it," I said, my voice flat. "I want it sold fast, and I want him out, today." Arthur studied the deed, then my face again. He nodded, a sharp, understanding gesture. "It's your property. We can list it immediately. We'll need to give them formal notice to vacate, but given the circumstances." He let the sentence hang, his meaning clear. We would use every legal tool to make it brutal and swift. "Make it hurt," I said, the first raw emotion I'd allowed myself to show. He picked up his pen. "Consider it done." The machinery of the law began to turn with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. By noon, a for sale sign was pounded into the front lawn I had seeded myself. By 2, a realtor was leading a young couple through the living room, their voices bright and hopeful as they discussed where their sofa would go. I watched from my truck parked down the street, a ghost at the feast. I saw Lena rush to the window, her face a mask of confusion, then horror as she saw the sign. She fumbled for her phone, no doubt calling my son Mark. The eviction notice was taped to the front door an hour later. It was cold, legal, and final. It gave them 72 hours to vacate the premises. The sale was already pending. The real explosion came when Mark returned from work. I heard his truck screech to a halt. He stormed up the walk, his laughter from the phone call I'd overheard now replaced with incoherent shouts. He ripped the notice from the door, his eyes scanning the words. I saw his body sag, the bluster draining from him, replaced by a bewildered fear. He stumbled inside, and the shouting began anew, this time directed at Lena, at the walls, at the world. I finally walked up the driveway. I stood in the doorway of the home I had built, watching him unravel. The living room was in disarray, boxes half-packed in a panic. He spun around, his eyes wild when he saw me. "You," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "What is this? What have you done, you old fool?" "I've sold my house," I said, my voice quiet, but cutting through his rage like a blade. "You can't, this is my house, my home." He took a threatening step toward me, his fist clenching, a pathetic echo of his previous power. I didn't flinch. I pointed a finger at the deed, which I had placed on the mantel. "Read it. Your name isn't on it. It never was. You've been living in my house, a guest who forgot his manners." The truth landed on him with physical force. He staggered back, his bravado crumbling. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "We can fix this. I'm sorry. I was drunk. I was stupid." 20 times, Mark," I interrupted, my voice still chillingly calm. "You hit me 20 times. Your wife laughed. There is no fixing that. You don't get to be sorry after the last blow lands. You only get the consequences." He looked at Lena, who was weeping silently on the stairs, then back at me, a desperate, cornered animal. "Where will we go? What will we do?" "That," I said, turning to leave, "is no longer my concern." The following days were a spectacle of their undoing. The movers came, impersonal and efficient, wrapping and removing the life they had built. Neighbors watched, their pity now firmly redirected from me to them. The whispers in the street were now about the son who betrayed his father and lost everything. The social currency they had spent so freely was now worthless. I did not stay to watch the final box being carried out. My work was done. I had taken the foundation from under his feet, and the resulting collapse was inevitable and complete. The house was sold to the young couple, who moved in with their own dreams, scrubbing the memory of my son's arrogance from the walls with fresh paint. I moved into a small, clean apartment. It was quiet. The silence here was my own, not a judgment. The money from the sale was secure, a nest egg for a piece I had earned. I heard about them, of course. Small towns have long memories. Mark and Lena moved into a cramped rental on the poor side of town. The friends who had cheered his cruelty vanished. The pride that had been his armor was now the shell of his shame. He was just a man who had lost it all, a living cautionary tale. Sometimes I see him in town. He looks older, defeated. He never meets my eyes. There are no words left between us. The lesson was written not in words, but in the loss of the very walls he thought would always protect him. He slapped me 20 times, thinking it made him a king. I signed a single piece of paper and showed him he was nothing but a pauper. My revenge was not delivered with a fist, but with a pen. It was quiet, it was legal, and it was absolute. And in the quiet of my new home, that silence has never been more peaceful.